Welcome to another episode of the EcoCiv podcast. I'm Andrew Schwartz, co-founder and vice president of EcoCiv, and it is my privilege to introduce Becky Kiddle, who's with me today. Becky is head of urban development for the Hutt City Council, which is the sixth largest city in New Zealand. She was formerly senior lecturer in urbanism at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand. And her research focuses on the nexus between people and physical space, as well as the use of urban design as a tool to support the making of cities that work for both people and the environment. A research focus she's now getting put to practice in her work as a head of urban development. So that's exciting stuff. She's interested in Maori identity as it relates to towns and cities and the role of young people in decision-making processes to do with built and natural environment. And she is author of chapter 25 in The New Possible, a chapter titled Fakafa Nungatanga as Blueprint for Radical Societal Transformation. And today we'll be talking about spatial justice. We'll be talking about how to redesign human communities for an ecological civilization. We'll be talking about all sorts of fun things. And Becky, thank you for joining me today.
No, thank you for having me.
So I've been thinking about the notion of community, and it seems to me that it's a term that gets used widely in society, but one that rarely includes discussion of its meaning. And actually, I think when we say, well, we need to rethink community for the long-term well-being of people on the planet, there's an implication that there's a problem with the way that modern human communities are designed. So just to get us started, could you say a little bit about sort of what is community and what are some of the fundamental problems with the modern approach to community?
Sure, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, I think it is hard to define what is community, and so the way, I guess, traditionally we've thought about community is obviously being geographical. So, you know, a particular village or town or whatever. And then as we've kind of had the ability to move much further, more easily, geographical community has in some people's eyes become perhaps less important, but I would suggest that actually it's still incredibly important. So whilst we have these perhaps sort of wider understandings of community now, maybe they're digital, maybe they're you know, they're sort of sports communities or cultural communities in our sort of very multicultural societies. Actually, geographical community is still important, and particularly in a place like New Zealand, where we seem to have all of the possible hazards under the sun. So we've got earthquakes and you know, lots of coastline, of course, because we're a few big islands, and obviously there's the issue of climate change. We also have social justice problems. The geographical community becomes all the more important in my view. And underlying that is, I guess, a sort of a way of thinking that has been long disregarded, and that's the Indigenous way of thinking. So Māori people of New Zealand are the Indigenous people here a lot longer than those who have come more recently. And we've been colonised, so my own background is my mother's Māori, also mixed heritage, and my father is what we call Pākehā or white New Zealander, and many Māori are mixed because of colonisation, and that's brought some great things, but it's also brought some really damaging things. And one of the damaging things it has brought, in my opinion, is some of these kind of overarching ideologies and ways of thinking about the world that have disregarded local community and the physical and natural environments in which those sit. So yeah, maybe that's how I'll answer that.
That's a great way to start, and it takes me in so many different directions because I want to know more about the Maori perspective on the environment around us, relationship between the more than human world and human communities. Um,
Mm,
but I also want to tap into something I think you were alluding to and something that you talk about in your chapter. Um,
mhm,
and that's sort of the colonization piece. So
mm,
I think some people would argue that a community it involves coming together,
mm,
and that coming together often takes place around sameness, because
mm,
differences they just serve to divide us. So we really just need to brought together around sort of what unifies us, and what unifies us is the absence of difference. It's
mm,
sameness, right?
mm,
But this I think you have argued that that's a colonizing approach to community that actually
mm.
results in the assimilation and the erasure of others, which I completely agree. I'll put my cards on the table. But I want to know, what would it
Mm,
look like to decolonize cities? What would it look like to build communities that embrace difference? Can
mm,
communities be built on difference alone? And if not, what actually does bind us together? And I have a
mm.
sense of how you might answer this, but I want to throw it on the table and see what you say.
Sure. Um, Absolute. I mean, we must be able to have diverse communities, and I guess to I guess what often is quite upsetting for Indigenous peoples and other minority groups is this. There's a sort of sense, I guess, amongst often the majority that if that as you rightly point out, that if that strong community is us all kind of are being the same, which absolutely kind of erases our unique identities, and that can only be a bad thing for anybody, whatever your identity. Um, I guess how do we do that successfully? How do we have diverse communities which are successful? And I think it's about power sharing mostly. And in New Zealand, we have this treaty, the Treaty of Waitangi, which was signed in 1840 between the British Crown and Māori chiefs, mostly to stop the French coming in and usurping the situation and taking over the land. So the British thought we better get in there quick. I was
Speaking
thinking,
of
oh,
power relations, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think that's a bit of a shame in some ways. Would have quite liked to have spoken French, but anyway. So the British got in there, and we were actually one of the last places to be colonised in the world. So the British had obviously done its dash across the world, including in the US. And by the time, and I'm simplifying things, obviously, by the time it got to New Zealand, there was a sort of some sense of needing to establish a sort of overarching framework for being in the country. And so that treaty has essentially, amongst other things, offered the opportunity for Māori to live in partnership with the new colonists. Unfortunately, the treaty wasn't well adhered to or kept over time, and so we're in a position now where many Māori communities have been disenfranchised and land has been taken and so on. But so kind of being able to live in this like it's fundamentally diverse New Zealand, not just Māori and white New Zealand population, but we now have a huge Asian population, Pacific population. Auckland is the biggest Pacific city in the world, as I understand it. There's Samoan, Tongan, Niuean, Fijian populations are huge in Auckland. So we have this sort of amazing richness, and the way I think we create solid communities is firstly by acknowledging the treaty and the power sharing arrangement it affords Māori, and we make sure that actually happens in practice, and we also start thinking about the other diverse communities we've got now in our worlds, and we start to think about how do we also share some power amongst them too. But I guess fundamentally, I would hope that this original power sharing arrangement could be enacted first, and then we start thinking about how we more fundamentally include other communities. Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, when it comes to power sharing, if we are starting from a position where a particular group has more power than the neighbors or the other members of the community, I mean, do those at the top, let's say, have to voluntarily share power? Is it something that they're sort of forced to do from pressure from those around them? I mean, how does that power sharing actually come to take place?
Well, I think good process is essential, right? So we don't want to do that in a way that mimics the colonizing process that happened to us in the past. So that we've got to be
colonize the colonizers, right?
Yeah, yeah, a recolonization process. Although maybe some would like that. But I think fundamentally we need to think about really good process, and I guess that's partly what some of the paper was trying to say is there's so there's a word in Māori called tikanga. So tika means right, and ngā is a plural. So it's sort of the right things, the right way of doing things, the right protocols. So understanding firstly what are the right protocols? How do you create ins for people into community spaces, allowing them to be themselves? Is super important, and obviously the best way is for those with lots of power to relinquish some power voluntarily, and actually you're starting to see that amongst young people in New Zealand, I think. So some colleagues and I recently wrote a book called Imagining Decolonisation, and surprisingly it's been on the bestseller list for about 18 months now. It's a little short book that tries to kind of detail what decolonisation is. And decolonisation is a very scary word for some people, but the book is selling amazingly well, and much more well than we expected. And I think it's because people are recognising that actually we need to change the way we do our worlds. And one of the points that I make in my chapter, which is called Colonisation Sucks for Everyone, which is really about trying to articulate that actually colonisation wasn't just bad for Māori or Indigenous people, it was also bad for non-Māori, is that overarching ideologies like capitalism and so on have actually come with colonisation, and they've screwed up our world, So just thinking about the themes of your organisation, these ideologies have been pernicious and destructive and in ways that have undermined the possibility for a good, strong community, both human community and non-human community.
Yeah. So you'd mentioned a couple of Maori terms and sort of principles, and there's one that is sort of central to your chapter, and I think a really helpful sort of take on thinking about community and relations, and that's this principle. And my Maori language skills are awful, but I'll say the principle of Fakafa Nungatanga, right? So close enough. It in your chapter, you suggest that it's the sort of first part, that Waka part of Fakafa Nungatanga, that is crucial if we're ever to move beyond needing to continuously assert that, quote, Black Lives Matter, right? So that there's something about this Waka aspect that helps us move beyond the exclusion, the oppression, the erasure of otherness. So what would it look like, basically? I mean, well, maybe start with what actually is Fakafa Nungatanga, and what would it look like to restructure communities, to redesign cities from this Waka perspective?
Sure. So Maybe if I start with the end of that word, so, well, the middle actually. Whānau means family. So, putting the whaka on the start of the word, sort of prefix of any word, means that it causes something to happen. So, Fakafa Nungatanga means essentially, like in simplistic English, to make family happen. And that could be taken in certain ways, but essentially what it's more meaning is that is about community building, you know. So whenever you go to a meeting or a formal occasion that's Māori led, you will always start with this whakawhanaungatanga whanaungatanga process, which actually can take ages. So, and it's about giving people a formal in to the community. And I don't know if you've ever kind of turned up to a meeting and people just launch into the subject matter and they don't know really who's in the room, and sometimes might feel like, you know, if you're an introvert like me, you can't really, you know, you don't know when you should kind of contribute or not. And whereas when you're sort of formally kind of welcomed into the group, there's an ability to sort of contribute well. And I've seen these processes go on for hours. And sometimes people on the outside will look and say, oh, that was a waste of time. We've just spent hours just hearing about one another, you know, where people are from, who their family are, you know, what are their connections, their genealogical connections. And I used to think that when I was a kid, oh, Jesus, it's taking ages. But as I grew up, you just realise just how important that formal into spaces is for all of us. And once you've gotten in, then you're part of the whānau, the family, and you can start to contribute. So I guess that's why I see it as being such an important sort of, I guess, overarching concept for the way that we think about communities generally. It's not, you know, at the moment, private property rights mean that we create, you know, we buy our home in a street, and if you're in New Zealand, it tends to be a standalone home, and you drive your car into your garage and you can go for days without meeting your neighbours and so on. And so we become really kind of insular in the way that we've structured our physical environments, and we've lost sight of the fact that actually these geographical neighbourhoods, to go back to the beginning, are actually they should be important parts of our lives, because if there's an earthquake, who do we go to? It's not the person over the other side of town, it's the neighbour who might help you out with some water or whatever it is that you need. So these geographical neighbourhoods will become so much more important as we move into a kind of era of, you know, bigger storms and impacts of climate change and so on and so on.
Yeah. So I'm just imagining then this, like, what it would look like to have human communities, to have neighborhoods, to have cities, to have architecture of apartment complexes, to have sort of arcology things like Saulo Polari or something like that. I mean, like, are there ways that we can design how humans live together that are better oriented toward sort of this making a family practice?
Absolutely. There's a model of community, in which I don't think I talk about in this paper, called Papa Kainga. So Papa Kainga means, Papa is actually speaking about Papa Tuanuku, who's Earth Mother in Māori sort of ideology, and then there's Kainga, which means home, and it's so it's kind of the notion of living close to the Earth Mother, creating home that's sort of integrated into the sort of natural environment, essentially. But in English terms, you may be able to sort of translate it as co-housing. So living with one another, sharing some kind of resources. We don't all need a lawnmower, you know, and so on and so on. And so those models of housing are really starting to become or be reinstated actually in New Zealand, where people are living in a way that allows a sharing of resources, social connectedness. You know, I read this really interesting article after our first COVID lockdown here in New Zealand, where they'd interviewed some families living in a papakainga. So there was a very large extended family of about 25, I think, living in this papakainga arrangement. And they were saying lockdown was fine for us. We had one person looking after the older people, the kaumatua. We had one person who did the grocery shopping for the 25 or whatever. We had one person looking after the kids, so the others could do their work when they needed to. And sure, it's a bit, you know, that it's not an option for lots of us, but it is possible, that kind of way of living. And actually, I've been working with some colleagues on a research bid. We haven't heard about the funding yet, but around, is there a possibility of creating actually a virtual papakainga so that we can get some of the benefits of this stuff, but not necessarily, because many of us don't have the resources to actually kind of create these physical spaces. Yeah.
That's so funny, because that was actually my next thought was the role of place and space for community. So for example, like what would the Maori community gain by having a digital community, but also what would be lost by disconnecting from physical space, or is it a digital connection of multiple physical spaces? Like I don't know, but I'm just curious on what you think about that. The function of space. I mean, yeah.
I do think for Māori, place is incredibly important. So again, there's a term in Māori called tūranga waiwai, and it translates to a place to stand. So where my feet stand, and that's the place that we belong to. So everybody has a tūranga waiwai, and that's a physical place. And so there's always going to be a need for that. I don't think the virtual space could ever do everything for us, but in times of disconnection, maybe it can do some of the job of connection, some of the job of sharing knowledge, sharing genealogies, understanding of whakapapa, which is genealogy, or sort of understanding who our ancestors are, all of those things. The digital space is starting to become much more important in some of that retention of knowledge. Because the other problem of colonisation, of course, is it sort of marks a time when knowledge transmission was severed. So many of us are scrambling to sort of reinstate some of that knowledge. But that's a whole another conversation. But yeah.
A conversation I hope to have someday. So I love this idea of sort of like a visioning process, right? So if we were to imagine, to dream for a moment, a world 50 years, 100 years from now, that's been transformed. Let's say that all of New Zealand has implemented sort of Maori principles for community. What does the world look like? How are cities designed? How are urban and rural places related? How do humans relate to the more than human world? How is indigeneity reflected in architecture? How are communities related to other communities? I mean, if you could paint a picture of what the world would look like, that's sort of bought into and implemented these core principles for community, what would it look like?
Yeah, that's a great question and a tricky question all in one. And it's surprisingly hard to imagine, you know, that in this world. But we have been doing a little bit of work around that and trying actually to draw on the public imaginary around what that might look like. So if anyone's interested, there's a website, www.idcities.co.nz, I think, where we held a public competition and we said, here's a particular site in Porirua, New Zealand. Come back at us with your imaginings about exactly what you're talking about. What does a decolonized city look like? And we asked for a whole range of different things so that anybody felt like they could be part of this. So we got poetry, we got animations, we got master plans, we got architecture, we got essays, we got some songs and haka. If you've seen the All Blacks rugby team play, they do a haka, a sort of war dance at the start of their matches. So somebody composed a new haka for a decolonized city. And we got a board game, which actually we've just been developing into an educational tool about decolonization. But I guess some of the clear themes are that humans and the natural world are inextricably linked. That we don't have domain over over our natural cousins, our non-human cousins. And so a sort of a Māori city would be one that recognises and upholds the mana, or the prestige of non-human things, creatures, the water, our soil. All of those things would be healthy and well in our cities, and that might include things like Wellington, for example, has culverted many of its streams. It might include daylighting those streams so that people can acknowledge that actually we are living on this sort of vibrant waterway system that used to give us fish and all sorts of other things, but we've concreted over it. It might be thinking about the way that we deal with water. So one of the things we've been talking about in the council is, do we need a better system than we currently have, where we send all our wastewater down a big pipe to a treatment station that sort of filters it and then sends it out to sea. In the Māori world, water, or wai, is incredibly important, and you wouldn't put dirty water into places that give us food, so actually, are there more local systems of wastewater treatment that we could be creating that might even be cheaper, that allow for us to not be kind of sort of constantly building a whole lot of pipe systems under the ground that are sending our water out to do things that we don't actually want it to do. What else? In terms of architecture, there has been quite a lot of movement around that. So they're starting in Christchurch in New Zealand post the earthquake. There was, Christchurch is a city that was modelled on Oxford, I think it was. It's named after Christchurch College in Oxford. And it's a beautiful kind of English garden city. It might also kind of allude to Ebenezer Howard's sort of garden city model. And obviously the earthquake completely, threw up the centre of the city. And so whilst it was a tragedy and it was a terrible time, it also offered this opportunity for Indigenous tribes in that area to go, hold on, we don't want to put this back how it was. You erased our identity in the last 100 years. Here's an opportunity for us to reinstate our identity and values in the way that we create this new city. So some fabulous examples coming out of Christchurch around Māori architecture, playgrounds, narratives being infused into things like the walkways, the sort of the pavement that's been used around the city to tell different local narratives about Māori chiefs and so on, and lots of public artworks, the sort of building up the ecology of the river that runs through the city, Yeah, so and around the country we're starting to see changes and people trying to create a very kind of Māori space when they think about architecture, but it's also down to the detail. So in Wellington they've changed the street lanterns, you know, you can walk now kind of street lanterns, and what you see now in some of the so you used to get a, you know, a sort of person walking when it turned green, or a person standing still if it was red. Now you get a very obviously Māori person walking. So they've got a sort of traditional pew on and so on, and a sort of, again, alluding to that haka, that war dance. And then when it stops, there's a thing called a taiaha, which is a sort of actually a weapon in the old days, and someone's standing there with this taiaha. So even sort of little sort of symbols like that have started to kind of infuse into our cities. But there's still a lot of thinking to go. But I think thinking of ourselves as guardians of the environment has to happen in the city. At the moment it happens, well, actually it's not happening that well in the rural settings, but there is a sense that it's a rural thing, but actually Māori, you know, cities are still Māori spaces, and kaitiakitanga, or guardianship of the natural environment, needs to happen here. The other thing is thinking about this as a whole system. You were talking about systems before. There's this fantastic phrase in Māori, what do you call them, proverbs, it's kiuta ki tai, which means from the mountains to the sea. You know, that's a whole system that we need to be thinking about. It's not just this particular place and this particular arbitrary, often political boundary that we've created for ourselves, but how are we thinking about this as a whole complex system?
That's fantastic. I love that. So many good things that you just said there that we could go a lot of different directions. But I think one of the things that I almost feel like the way that I framed the question may have been problematic. So I want to step back for a second and reframe it,
Okay.
because so what I was thinking was, was I implying a sort of recolonizing of the world from using Maori principles, right? Like, so is there sort of one way that all local communities and all cities should look? But what I was hearing in your response was quite the opposite. There was a sort of respect for indigeneity, which might mean that in the details, right, that your crosswalk lights look different in China than they would in New Zealand, and different there than they might in Uganda. Like that, there's just that there's something about the respect for difference and diversity that, when it becomes universalized, sort of steps back to create space for others, in a sense. Does that make sense? Like I don't know. I'm not sure I have a clear thought on what I'm trying to get at, other than the importance of context. That I think that when I imagine ecological civilization, I don't imagine something that looks the same, uniform all over around the world. That each place with its own history, its own context, its own geography, its own people is going to manifest this differently. And that's what I guess I was hearing in your response about the vision of what's already happening, what you would love to see happen in your own context, is that it is very much taking on these unique pieces of Maori history and culture and place, and then sort of having those manifest in the way that community is developed. And I don't know, I didn't ask a question.
No, but I think you're absolutely right. It's got to be place-based. It's got to be of that place. Otherwise, you know, someone develops some principles and we just all use those and we get the same everywhere, and it's actually just another form of colonisation. So it's got to be of that place. And actually in New Zealand now, there's a very clear so government at least is very clear that this treaty I was talking to you about before mandates the partnership with the local tribe or tribes. So actually the relationship is not with Māori generally. The treaty relationship is with that particular tribe, or in the case of somewhere like Auckland, the 19 tribes, I think, that inhabit are from that particular place. And that necessarily will result in different outcomes. I mean, there's of course themes that are similar across Māori tribes, but there's a very staunch kind of feeling amongst many tribes that no, we have our own identity. And actually the word Māori is a relatively new term, because it only came into common use as the name of the people that are now called Māori when Europeans came to this country. Māori means normal. So so they needed some kind of unifying term to bring everyone together. And so they thought, oh well, we're the normal ones. You guys are the odd ones coming to this country. So it just means normal. So for example, drinking water is called Wai Māori. It's normal water. It's not seawater. It's not wastewater. It's not and so now there's a real movement to say, well, actually, I'm not Māori. I'm Ngāti Porou, or I'm Ngāpuhi. These are tribes. These are specific tribes. To say, well, we've got our own identity. Sometimes we have our own dialect. Sometimes we have, we've definitely got our own tikanga that's different from yours, and tika is in the protocols, and so on and so on. So yes, place-based is super crucial across countries, but also within countries. And in the US, surely it's the same with the different, tribal groups across the country who, I remember talking to a First Nations person who I do a little bit of work with around Indigenous architecture, and they were sort of frustrated because everyone sort of imagined that the teepee was a First Nations thing, when actually it's a particular tribal, sort of piece of architecture. Essentially, it's not everybody's way of doing architecture.
Yeah, and I think it also makes you wonder. I mean, anytime you get a large group of people together, the bigger the community, I would imagine the greater the diversity. Which then, if diversity was the goal, one could question whether or not bigger communities is actually the goal. And I think we probably would say, well, maybe that comes with problems that maybe undermine the importance of diversity, since we think sharing and distribution of power locally is probably more important. But where do I want to go from there? So I know we're cutting short on time, and there's a couple things I want to make sure we touch on. One is some challenges and obstacles. So we're talking about transforming communities and cities to promote the well-being of people on the planet. We're talking about promoting familial relations with our neighbors. We're talking about justice and sustainability, and so what's in the way of us trying to achieve those goals? What are the biggest obstacles in the way? And then what are some of the key leverage points for change? And I imagine you're already leveraging some of those in your new position as head of urban development.
Sure. So I think one of the big obstructions, barriers to change, is that people are still thinking in very siloed ways. So I get some of my colleagues thinking about environmental and climate justice in isolation of social justice, and they're inextricably linked. If you're a wealthy white New Zealander who lives 10 minutes walk from town in your lovely colonial villa, and you're pushing for climate change you know, in terms of transport use and so on, that's all very well, because you can walk to town in 10 minutes and you have great access to amenity and so on and so on. If you're, you know, maybe lower socioeconomic community that's pushed to the edge of the city, away from good transport routes, it takes you an hour to get to employment opportunities. The train service is crap and the buses don't turn up on time. And you've got, you know, a dunga of a car that uses lots of petrol and spits out a whole lot of gas or whatever. You know, these things, if you're not understanding the kind of reasons why people are living the way they are, and you're not kind of getting to the root of trying to fix that social inequality or inequity, you're doomed, because you're trying to solve a problem in isolation of the complex system that it's part of. So I think that's one of the key barriers I would see. And sorry, your next question was about what are we doing about it? No, sorry, I've forgotten.
Basically.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Well, what are we doing about it? So I'm 4 weeks into this new job, so I'm gonna plead not quite there yet, but I think what are we doing about it is we need to be, or we are trying to think about these things in unison. So how are we solving the, you know, thinking about Lower Hutt. Lower Hutt's probably the most vulnerable city in the country to things like sea level rise, flooding, that kind of thing, you know, as a result of the changing climate from climate change. It's a very low-lying city. It's, you know, got problems with potentially being subject to tsunamis and things like that. So we've got a huge issue on our hands because it's a low-lying valley floor that we're dealing with. It's also being seen as the panacea to solve the big housing crisis we've got in New Zealand. We're really lacking in housing. So we've got this incredible tension around, we've got this low-lying land that's really vulnerable, but it's also providing opportunities for us to put in, you know, high, medium density housing and solve some of the housing crisis. And I still don't know what the answer to that is, but I think we absolutely at least must be thinking about these things in unison. Otherwise, we're gonna shoot ourselves in the foot and create more problem. You know, a solution that works for a short time, but is myopically focused and not thinking about, well, hold on, does this stand up for 50 years down the track or 100 years down the track? Which is another thing that Indigenous people, I think, offer the world. There's this very long, intergenerational way of thinking about our world. You know, it's not just about this place. And in fact, the local tribe are the only ones that you will know will still be part of the conversation in 50 or 100 years. You know, when this particular lot of politicians are gone, when this particular lot of, you know, bureaucrats have gone, the local tribe will be the ones still there. So they're the ones that we need to be really helping us drive the change we need in the city. Sorry, that's probably
a really cool insight.
Oh, was it? It felt a bit vague, but that's because I'm a bit vague in my
I like that. Well, so we've talked about some of the problems. We've talked about sort of our dream and our vision. We've talked about the challenges and the obstacles. I want to conclude with talking about hope, right? So you've already noted the problems are complex. They're interconnected. We need to get to the root cause of social environmental challenges and how human communities are designed. We need to redesign them for flourishing of people and planet. And that also involves changing our mindset and our perspective and our worldviews. So in the midst of all of this, what gives you hope?
What gives me hope? I think it feels like there is starting to be an alignment between what Indigenous people have been saying and thinking for years, and what some of the more transformational thinkers in the world are thinking about, what needs to happen. I mean, Noam Chomsky, who's apparently the most cited academic in the world, in one of his, I often use this quote because I think it's really cool, but he talks about the, Indigenous people being their way of thinking being the way that we should all be thinking about these things, and he says it's much more eloquently than that, but there seems to be an alignment, right? There's starting to be people who are understanding, I mean, this more than human sort of phraseology is sort of feels relatively recent, and I've heard a lot in geography circles, and yet it was a sort of way of life for Indigenous people for years, and so that feels hopeful to me, that there's some new thinking coming on. As I said, I think young people are really, and this sounds a bit twee, but I've just been really, I guess, I don't know. I mean, one of the reasons I found university a little bit stifling is actually, ironically, perhaps even, universities are a bit stuck in terms of the way they're thinking about knowledge and knowledge creation and so on, particularly in the urbanism and architecture fields. And actually young people are much more transformative and thinking about the politics of placemaking and of architecture and so on. So that gives me real hope. And we're actually seeing many more both, I think progressive, perhaps, young people coming through alongside many more Indigenous people coming through universities and sort of slowly transforming what is a reasonably colonial institution. So maybe those two things are the things off the top of my head that are giving me hope.
Which is now, by extension, giving me hope. So thank you for that. It's been a joy talking to you. Absolutely. And I hope to do it again sometime soon. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. I know you're busy with your new job, and I am so glad that we could get this conversation scheduled. So for all those who are listening, I really encourage you to check out Becky's chapter 25 in The New Possible. She also mentioned a really cool website that you may want to look at. It's idcities.co.nz, looking into imagining decolonized cities, which is a really cool project. So Becky Kiddle, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.